to start an economic war.
This is between US and China.
The Trump administration comes in and says we are going to increase, but it is a refreshing welcome.
Good day, everyone. My name is Muhammad Ihsan, and I'm here with Professor Naser from the School of International Studies of the University of Jordan. So, Professor, with Trump's re-election, all eyes are on the US-China trade as well as their relations. So, we are going to basically going to a new phase, maybe, of a trade war between the two countries, since it didn't end or didn't conclude in the Biden administration. So, maybe before we start off what will be at stake with Trump's administration, maybe so our audience can have a clear understanding of what is a trade war, maybe you can provide us some definition of what is a trade war.
Yes, indeed. However, we want to emphasize that until now, we don't really know what the new administration, the Trump administration, going to do. Now, if we look at the history of the Trump's remarks over the last few months, he has made and insinuated that he is going to adopt certain policies toward China, and we have to wait and see. But, to answer your question on what is it a trade war, what is a trade war? If we take the case of the United States and China, those two are two big countries. They are huge countries, tremendous resources. They are producers of so many products in agriculture, in manufacturing, in IT, in technology, and so forth. And they are trading with each other. But the problem is that a man like President Trump is telling the Chinese, look, we are buying from you a lot more than you are buying from us. And this is what they call trade deficit. So, basically, the United States, in the foreign analysis, when the U.S. considers this balance sheet between the Chinese and the Americans find out that they are, buying more than the Chinese are buying by about $370 billion. In other words, it is in favor of the Chinese. The Chinese are selling to the Americans a lot more than they're buying from America. And this is, according to the Trump administration, is unacceptable. Here the Americans are telling the Chinese, if you continue to do this unfair trade practices, we will retaliate by what can we do? We'll impose on you, trade tariffs. And these tariffs, we can increase them all the way from 5% to 100% to make your products more expensive. You cannot sell in the United States so easily in the future. And this could start from one part, and then the other country will retaliate. And there will be other retaliation back and forth. It's a trade war that would be exhausting for both countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's going to be like a tit for tat.
Yes,
where
indeed.
The U.S. increased tariff, the China will retaliate and do the same thing.
Exactly.
I see. Okay, so probably the audience will be wondering, this is between U.S. and China. So what will be the implication for the rest of the world? I mean, we see it all over the news, but people will say that, why is this so important?
Well, you see, our world has become so interconnected. Mm-hmm. And trade and finance is directly related and on daily basis and influenced by what happens in different parts of the world. Now, for example, if the Trump administration comes in and says we are going to increase basically tariffs, or we're going to levy tariffs or impose tariffs 25% on all, let's say, hand towels or toilet paper that comes in America, then the U.S. consumers are going to have to pay for that amount. The prices of commodities, products that are being used on daily basis in the American market, the American consumer will have to pay for it. In other words, if the consumer has to pay for it, that means there is inflation. If there is inflation in the price of certain oil products, any products that comes from China, then this inflation and the prices will ultimately lead to policies from the Federal Reserve Bank. They will have to adjust basically interest rates based on the market, based on how much trouble has been created. Did this increase in the price and the tax and the tariffs, did it affect the job market? By how much? By what percentage? What is the rate of unemployment? This also can affect basically the stock markets around the world. If interest rates increase, the stock markets and the volume of trade will increase. The price of commodities throughout the world will increase as a result, and a direct relationship with the increase in the price of commodities in the United States. So the U.S. market and the U.S. rates influence the world at large. Today, we are finding out, for example, that interest rates in the last 6 months or 9 months increased because interest rates were increased in the United States. The U.S. leads and the world follows in terms of financial institutions. How much of what's the interest rates? We are hoping that interest rates will be reduced in the United States, so the rest of the world will have to pay less for interest, which affects loans for agriculture, for housing industry, for all kinds of institutions. The world has become like a global village, interconnected. Whatever happens in one part of the world affects the whole world. And we can give you multiple of examples on, basically meat, food, when we talk about, grain and so forth. The list can go on forever, and how it is so interconnected.
Yes.
Please, we'll elaborate more.
All right, Professor. So now let's focus on Donald Trump at his second term. So do you think Donald Trump has a solution to the trade imbalance between the U.S. and China?
Yes, I think that President-elect Trump can have an impact. But, I mean, what kind of measures would he apply and use to affect trade relations between China and the United States has a limit. Now, we must realize that, the United States is dependent upon China for a great number of commodities and supplies. We remember during COVID-19 when, let's say the containers and ships could not reach, the harbors around the United States. A lot of products were empty on the shelves. People in the United States could not get, products that are needed for daily basis, including, important issues for sterilizing, for medical supplies, and so forth. They needed the equipment, they couldn't find it. So now Mr. Trump can increase tariffs 5%, 6%, 7%, 15%, but, it's not a one-way road. The Chinese can retaliate. And also that the Americans, as we have referred to in the first part of our discussion, is that who's going to pay for it? It's the American citizen who's going to pay for it. He has to take this in consideration. How fast and how big is this expected tariff is going to come about? What's it going to do to consumerism in America, to the interest rates? How would it affect interest rates? I mean, the Americans could, impose tariffs on Chinese cars, but in the final analysis, how much of a tariff are you going to impose on Chinese cars coming to the United States? Can you make a deal with the Chinese whereby, for example, you can do joint ventures where some production would take place? It is not a one-way road. There has to be a rational, realist approach, and the Chinese are also aware of the fact. The Chinese are not out there to start an economic war because they're looking for the markets, they're looking for opportunities throughout the world. And mind you, the percentage of trade between the Chinese and the American is approximately 8 to 9% of the whole U.S. trade that is being done globally. But then again, countries in Latin America, Central America, and Africa will get affected by those prices and the increase in cost of production in the United States or in China, because ultimately the cycle will continue, and those people who are having a hard time meeting ends and means, they will have to pay a higher price for grain, for their food supplies and so forth. And it's a cycle. What happens in the United States and the stock market and the tariffs will affect the continental United States as a whole. And if it affects the continental United States as a whole, it's going to affect all countries of the world, in Africa, in Asia, and particularly in underdeveloped countries where they are dependent upon imported food to come into their countries.
Yes, because of the interconnected world.
Yes, indeed.
Now, I would like to move to the G20 summit that is currently happening right now as we're speaking. So, President Biden met with President Xi Jinping, and President Xi Jinping stated that he is willing to cooperate with the next administration, which is the Trump administration. What does this imply?
The Chinese are rational. They would like to work out these problems, find a compromise solution. And they have done that time and again, not only in terms of trade, but there are political problems, issues that has to deal with the China Sea, the islands, issue of Taiwan, the issue of Hong Kong, and so forth. And the Chinese seem to be cool-headed. They are hoping to find a compromise solution, and it is the interest of all parties. Now, it depends on the Trump administration to what extent when they take over on January 15th, they're going to be hot-headed. I definitely think that they will look at this issue rationally and in a reasonable way to find a middle ground where they can work with the Chinese. And the Chinese are already sending signals that they are willing to work with the new administration. They are very reasonable, rational, decision makers.
Okay, Professor. So was the trade war more about an economic or a geopolitical dominance between the US and China, considering China's rise in power and also their goal to basically double the US economy in the next decade?
Well, it's a very important question that you're asking. But, we have to look at what the Chinese have done geopolitically over the last decade, okay? The Chinese have been reaching out to many of the developing countries around the world by actually increasing their influence, economic influence, by providing, loans, expertise, factories, bridges, and so forth throughout the world. And, those countries are mainly those countries that are underdeveloped. They are not really spending any money in the Persian Gulf area. They are only mainly doing it in Africa, in Asia, and that is, appreciated and welcomed by the less developed countries of the world. But there is limitation. Their influence is limited to economic issues, and it is not aggressive, and it is not blended with a military threat to the U.S. interest in the region, or let's say a strategic alliance. It is not a strategic alliance with the countries of the world, particularly the third world, but rather it is the Chinese exerting and showing influence around the world, mainly through economic issues. Now, Chinese have refrained in the last decade or so from ever increasing geopolitical tensions through direct military intervention. They have not done that, and they are not planning to do that, and they have not built any bases and alliances, military alliances, with any countries of the third world. So from that perspective, we can see that, there is an aggressive policy that is being, adopted by the U.S. administration regarding, containment of Chinese influence around the world. But when we look at it from at the macro level, this influence is very limited and is merely an economic one. At no time has Chinese acted in any way that is a threat to the stability of the international system, and by introducing weapons of mass destruction through their fleets or throughout allies and throughout the region, throughout Southeast Asia, through Africa, through the Middle East. They have not done that. So we are not really concerned. There has to be some kind of a compromise, a rational one that would be found to manage the relations between the Chinese and the Americans. This reminds me, of the era of the Vietnam War. And during the Vietnam War, they fought a war that lasted from the mid-50s until 1972 when the Paris Peace Agreement was signed. But before that, Henry Kissinger and Nixon had to reach a conclusion that the war has to stop because it is exhausting, has exhausted America, exhausted the world, cost them 55,000, American soldiers, the lives of 55,000. And rationality meant that they have to talk. So talking, they started the famous ping pong talks, which is, American ping pong.
Diplomacy.
Diplomacy, yes, exactly. The ping pong diplomacy, and ultimately this led to the full normalization of relations between the United States and China.
Yes.
Definitely there are problems with technology, with microchips and so forth. But if the Americans are willing to sell it, if the Europeans are willing to sell the technology, they are buying the technology now. And the president can put certain restrictions on the transfer of technology to the Chinese. He can prevent the Chinese from putting any control on investment to basically transfer technology to China. He can do that. And the Chinese are willing to compromise. They are willing to Chinese to play ping pong again.
Okay, Professor. So for the last question, I'm going to touch again on the BRICS. Basically, they're expanding right now with new members. Saudi Arabia, Iran, as well as other countries. Indonesia is also looking to be part of BRICS. They're expanding, and this is basically enhancing the global South relations. China is one of the main players at the BRICS with Russia, as well as South Africa, as well as Brazil, a growing economy that are developing countries. So do you think the BRICS, they're established basically to counter the U.S. influence globally?
In all honesty, the BRICS is a wonderful, group of nations, global South, which is getting together, to help each other, to have better understanding, better economic cooperation between the countries of the South. And it's absolutely important, to be dependent upon the United States to influence the world economy is not good, or to depend upon one international power, a unipolar system, is not acceptable. So to bring these countries together, if they can help improve the standard of living of those who are living in the South, then that's absolutely wonderful. Now, but you have to, take this with a grain of salt, The United States was not in the meeting in Brazil.
BRICS.
And BRICS, it's not a party to the BRICS. And the United States is an important superpower that will influence the world economy and influence it strategically, economically, and so forth. And everybody that is attending the meeting realizes that, and they realize also that they will have to communicate and cooperate and negotiate and bargain with the United States of America because it's an important actor in the international system. But it is a refreshing welcome to see this organization expanding further, and Saudi Arabia is invited. Other countries important, like the Chinese, are being invited. But the members themselves realize that this is not an organization that is militant in its objectives, that want to create further problems and another Cold War between the North and the South. No, on the contrary, I think they are all seek to cooperate among each other and cooperate with all world bodies that exist, including the ones that are available at the United Nations.
Yes.
It's a global village. It is a world where multinational corporations influence, events and prices and trade around the world. Now we realize that the issue of technology and development in the field of technology is so important and is affecting also the lives of all individuals. Some would suggest that this meeting and the objective is to do a de-dollarization of the U.S. dollar. It's not so easily. It is not so easy to do that. The dollar is the number one world currency, and it would not be possible to replace it overnight, despite the fact that there might be others who want to introduce other currencies, such as the Chinese. But then again, people ask the question about the U.S. economy, particularly the economy. And if you look at, for example, the case of China and Russia, those are huge economies, huge countries with their borders stretching over thousands of miles. It would take you about 6 to 7 hours to fly from one side of Russia to the other, from China to the other, about 6, 7 hours, and the same for the United States. We're talking about important superpowers, regional powers, you call it, and we all have to be rational that the cooperation and easing conflict between the parties and negotiating funding solutions will be the answer, the only answer. There can be nothing less or more. The world cannot afford any confrontations, particularly when it comes to strategic weapons. Strategic weapons is a no-no. You cannot do that, because if you ever move from direct negotiations, economic cooperation, to military confrontation, then you're going back to the policies of the 1950s and 60s, massive assured destruction, which we don't welcome at all.
Yes, and I believe that President Putin also recognized that it's not that easy to replace the US dollar. And I also see BRICS as basically one global south where they can unite their voice, and not just in economy, but also in political stance, because they're also vocal when it comes to what is going on in each and every region, especially with what is going on in the Middle East right now. So yeah, Professor Naser, thank you so much for your time. Looking forward for the
Thank
next
you,
discussion.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, sir.